Again, my apologies that we had to start a little bit late today. That shouldn't be an ongoing problem. We'll work on that. So I'm delighted to see you here today. Happy to see the turnout for our second speaker in the series, Whom You Love. I'll remind those of you that might be coming for the first time that you can learn more about the symposium. The easiest way is to go to whomyoulove.com. I'm especially happy to have Sari Van Anders here today for all sorts of reasons. We share an academic lineage of a bit, for one thing, but also I've been watching her career for some time. She got a bachelor's degree from Western Ontario and a master's degree there, and then she went to Simon Fraser University in Vancouver to get her Ph.D., which was just in 2007, just a blink or two ago for someone my age. And she's been remarkably productive. I kidded her that I was going to read her entire CV for 25, 30 minutes beforehand, but I won't do that. But I will give you an idea of the sorts of things that she's been doing. So just reading the titles of some of her papers over the years. Testosterone levels in women and men who are single, in long-distance relationships, or same-city relationships. Are gonadal steroids linked with orgasm perceptions and sexual assertiveness in women and men? A theme emerges, I think, you'd say. And then, baby cries and nurturance affect testosterone in men. And I'm not going to talk about whether this particular progression of titles has anything to do with her life, except to say she's been very productive, doing lots of very interesting things, and so I'm delighted that she's going to be here talking to us about it today. Welcome, if you would please, Dr. Sari Van Anders.
Thanks. Is everything working? Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really excited to be able to talk with you about my research. I'm interested in intimacy and testosterone, so sexuality, partnering, and nurturance. And today, some of the things I want to talk to you about are going to take me back and forth between theory and lab research. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is thinking about sexual minorities, both sexual orientation and something I'm going to be proposing to you today called relational orientation. Then I'm going to be talking about some of the research on partnering and testosterone, some background on T, and then some background on that research, including research from our own lab, and then some fresh data, hot off the presses, hot off the SPSSs. Tough crowd. And then I'm going to talk about implications of that research for partnering and testosterone, including thinking about polyamory, asexuality, and gendered sexuality more broadly. So it's been really interesting for me because I do research that involves sexual minorities, and to think about why we might put sexual minorities together. So we might think of sexual minorities that have to do with the gender of their partner interest. We might think of sexual minorities that are sexual minorities because of the behaviors they engage in. We might think of sexual minorities who are sexual minorities because of the behaviors they don't engage in. And it's interesting to think why we put them all together, even though they're quite a diverse group. Excuse me. And so when we think of what ties sexual minorities together, obviously a big one is stigma, right? These are stigmatized identities, stigmatized behaviors, stigmatized expressions, stigmatized orientations a lot of the time, depending on the time and place. And that's certainly true here, including in the state of Michigan. And there's also social prescriptions around these sexual identities, sexual minority identities, including laws and various rules, what groups you can join, and so on. And I don't really think you can overemphasize the importance of the stigma and social prescriptions and the effects that has on communities and individuals. At the same time, for the purposes of my research, I want to talk about something else that we can think of tying sexual minorities together, and that's for theoretical and conceptual reasons. So over here, I have orientation, status, and identity. And one of the things I want to talk about is how we can think of all sexual minorities, and I'm going to talk about sexual minorities too, as having orientations, statuses, and identities. And by orientation, I mean interests, sexual approaches, and sexual attractions. By status, I mean the actual sexual behaviors you're engaging in or not engaging in. And by identity, I mean the label that you use to identify your sexuality and your sexual being, the community that you engage with, and its identity is also has to do with politics because it has to do with positioning yourself in the world. So what's really fascinating is these are actually disciplinary specifics. So we might think of each person as having an orientation, a status, an identity. But as sex researchers, we tend to focus here on orientation, whereas people in public health, for example, tend to focus there. So you might hear the term MSM or WSW, men who have sex with men, women who have sex with men, and they're interested in the behavior really, not what you might more want to do, not who you associate with, but what you're actually doing. And then we see over here with identity, you might have people in the social sciences, various ones, or the humanities, being interested in identities, politics, communities, how we build our identities, and so on. And so different disciplines might be studying what they think are the same thing, but actually aren't. Right? So we might talk about sexual minorities, and we might mean different things. And so that's often a bit of a barrier for us to communicate with each other. Now, in terms of sexual minorities, I think the classic reason we think of differentiating these ones is someone, the man who has a straight identity is engaging in sexual activity maybe with his wife and then with other men on the side. And then we would say, or he might say, or some sort of measure might say he has a homosexual orientation. So that's sort of the classic example of differentiating these three, right? That they're not always the same. It could be, a lesbian woman who engages in sex with women and is interested in women, but it doesn't have to be. And what's interesting is when we think of this consistency, what is consistent or homogeneous, what is inconsistent or heterogeneous, there's no real reason why we have to say one identity has to go with one orientation or one status, except that we tend to see certain ones go together. Now, in terms of other sexual minorities, we can think of the same thing. So you might have, let's say, a person who engages in kink behaviors. She doesn't identify with the kink community. Maybe she's engaging in kink behaviors because her partner is interested in them. So she doesn't identify with the kink community, and she might not even be particularly interested in kink behaviors, but again is doing them because her partner does them. So we can see with sexual minorities, you can also go to orientation, status, and identity in the same way we can with sort of more typical sexual orientation. Now, I titled this slide Beyond Sexual Minorities because I've been talking about sexual minorities as if only sexual minorities have a sexuality, but of course, we all have a sexuality, or whether it's a present sexuality or a sexuality that we're not engaging in, right? So there's asexuality, some of us are engaging in sexual activity, some of us aren't. And what happens usually in sex research, from what I've seen and in lots of fields, is that marginality is noticed and theorized. So we tend to start from marginal identities and then move to majority phenomena. So we might think about sexual minorities, then start thinking about sexual majorities to try to understand sexuality more broadly. But we often don't really even know to start theorizing sexual majorities until someone points out that that is a majority, that there's something else, right? It's not just that one thing. Now, when we think about sexual orientation, what we typically mean is the gender of yourself relative to the gender of the partners you're interested in being sexual with. And of course, that assumes that gender is a key facet of our sexuality. And I think that's an assumption for this time and place. It's not necessarily an assumption that holds true forever. And as I said, there's these disciplinary differences. So we know sexual orientation very well. We have a sexual status, and we have a sexual identity. And interestingly, as you all know, language changes over time. So we used to call what we now call sexual orientation sexual preference. Now we use the term sexual orientation. They don't necessarily mean the exact same thing, although people sometimes, for a time of that transition, would use them interchangeably. And now we're often transitioning, a lot of people are transitioning into sexual identity. And it still doesn't actually mean the same thing, even though we might replace sexual orientation with identity, right? Now we're talking about this more communities or labels as opposed to just your interests or approaches. But of course, the question for me as a scientist is, what do I call the thing that overlaps all three of these? What's the overarching umbrella term? And we often will say, well, by sexual orientation, I mean there's identity, status, and behaviors. But of course, that's kind of tricky because sexual orientation is one of the umbrella terms, one of the underlying umbrella terms as well. So it makes language kind of different for someone like me who wants to be able to theorize the painful minutia of sexuality. And I guess you shouldn't make jokes about pain and talks about sexuality. So one of the things I'm going to do in this talk is use gendered sexuality as an umbrella term for very strategic reasons that will become clear. It's not just to laden you with jargon and confuse you. One of the reasons I'm going to do that is we could ask ourselves, where do other sexual minorities come in? We often think of these, back to that question I started with, we think of sexual minorities together, including people who are minorities by gendered sexuality, and individuals who are sexual minorities in ways that have nothing to do with gender. So how do they come together? One of the ways I said was, they all have an identity, a status, and an orientation. And so what I'm going to try to argue here, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is that we could think of each person as having a sexual configuration of which gendered sexuality is one aspect. And people have a sexual orientation, a sexual status, and a sexual identity that falls into gendered sexuality. And let me give you a reason why I want to make gendered sexuality sort of a subcategory of something else. Now, we were talking about gendered sexuality and the differences between identity, orientation, and status. And so if you just focus on this one here, if we think of identity, we can think of people having a queer identity, bisexual identity, pansexual, asexual, lesbian, gay, and then also increasingly heterosexual, which, of course, was sort of an unmarked identity that people didn't even realize was an identity until someone sort of pointed it out, like, that's so het. And we can think, you might think, is there really a relational identity? And you know what? There are. Right? So some of us might know this and some of us might not, depending on where we stand in our own relational identities. So there are people who identify as polyamorous. There are people who identify as asexual, and I'm going to argue later why I put that over here. There are people who identify as players. There are people who who identify as monogamous or monoamorous. There are people who identify as a friend with benefits. So there's all sorts of relational identities that we might think of, even though we haven't really put those together necessarily under similar language. So we can see that both gendered sexuality and relational sexuality have identities. What about statuses? Let's jump to this one. So as I said, we have MSM, men who have sex with men, WSW, women who have sex with women, not sexually active, I guess. I don't think there's quite a fancy NSA acronym. And then, of course, there's other gender sexually active, which I don't think is that marked either, but there's no reason why it couldn't be. We just usually call that sexually active, and the others are the specialty cases, right? And then people answer relationship status all the time. Single, dating, partnered. We might think of multi-partnered, people who have multiple relationships. And we might think of cheating, too, because it's not really monoamorously partnered. You're partnered but doing other things. And then what about, is there an orientation parallel as well? And I'm going to argue that there is. And that's a lot of what my talk is going to be arguing. So with gendered sexuality in terms of an orientation, the terms we use are things like homosexual, which I've sort of fought with over the past 5 years, trying to decide whether to use it or not. And I've usually erred on the side of not, because it's so pathologized in the medical community. It has a really regressive history, especially in behavioral neuroendocrinology, where people would give T treatments to try to treat homosexuality, give testosterone treatments to try to treat homosexuality, and so on. At the same time, it's kind of useful to use here because it's not an identity and it's not necessarily a status. So there is a use to it that I'm kind of coming around to. Heterosexual, we might also say non-gendered. People don't really think about that, but what about someone who, it's not that they're interested in all genders, it's just that gender isn't a feature, and we haven't really theorized that very much. Lisa Diamond's work a little bit has, but it hasn't really made it into our language. And some of the terms I'm going to use are things like multisexual and unisexual for the relational orientations. So the notion that you can be interested in having multiple partners, or just one, or maybe none. And I'll talk about that more. So what I'm arguing here, and this is a bit of a confusing slide, so let me help explain, is that each person has a sexual configuration. And each person in that has a gendered sexuality with an orientation, status, and identity. So it's not just gay people who have a sexual orientation. And each person has a relational sexuality, right? So it's not just polyamorous people who have a relational identity. We all do. And so what this is trying to show you is that each strangely triumphant person has, I had limited picks on my PowerPoint selection. Each person has a sexual configuration, taking gendered and relational sexuality into account. Now, I'm not at all proposing that this is limited to gendered sexuality and relational sexuality. I think there's many more we could go into, but these are the ones I'm focusing on in my talk and the ones that I'm interested in. And another way to put it, another reason to think of sexual minorities together is sort of switching the tree, for those of you who are interested in is it clade diagrams, I think? You'll appreciate this, and this is for the nerdy ones of us here. You know, we can think of each person as having orientations, both gendered sexuality and relational sexuality, statuses with the both, and identities. So we can sort of orient it to highlight that people have different gendered sexualities and relational sexualities, or we can highlight that people have different orientations, identities, and statuses. And if you're like, that kind of seems like the same thing, it is. It's just organized a little differently. So at this point, I want to just take a short break and do a, we've only started, but let's take a breather, a brief summary, because I think I've introduced a lot of new concepts. So what I'm arguing is each person has a sexual configuration, which is made up of gendered sexuality, which we used to call and we still call sexual orientation, relational sexuality, and that one's a new one that I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. And each person has multiple orientations, identities, and statuses. They may be heterogeneous, meaning that they don't align in the ways we stereotypically assume they should, although again, we can question our assumptions about what should be aligned and what shouldn't. And they may be homogeneous. And so what I'm trying to say is that conceptually, it makes sense to think of sexual minorities beside each other and together for basic sexuality knowledge more broadly. But now I want to go back to relational sexuality and talk a little bit more about that. Because I talked about this gendered sexuality and relational sexuality, and now what I'm trying to do is make it so confusing that you can't follow anything I say, and talk about two different aspects. I want to talk about partnered sexuality and partnered relationality. So now what I've done is divided that sort of relationship category into two categories. So 1 into 2. And why am I doing that? Why am I dividing this into two kinds? And the reason for that is because there are two relational systems. So one of the things that's been most exciting to me about the field of relationships, sexuality, and evolution is that a lot of recent research has talked about what pair bonds are for, and what they're about, and what neurobiological systems contribute to them. And we can think of pair bond systems as involving love and lust. So when you think of your romantic sexual relationship with a partner, people have talked about they involve love, but they also involve lust, right? Both of those. And that's not the case necessarily everywhere, but these are the sorts of pair bonds that we're focusing on right now. And so we can think of love as being a nurturant system, and we can think of lust as being a sexual system. And what we've talked about, and what research is suggesting, is that the nurturant system evolved to promote parent-offspring bonds. And the parent-offspring bonds actually promote infant survival. So for infants who need some sort of care, nurturant systems help make sure that care happens by promoting parent-offspring bonds. And we also have this other system, so we have two systems, the nurturant system and the sexual system, and the sexual system evolved to promote reproduction. But we also know that the sexual system facilitates pair bond development. So sexual activity itself can promote pair bond development or feelings of intimacy and closeness. And pair bonds themselves can promote reproduction, but also one of the theories coming out of biological anthropology and other disciplines is that one of the functions of pair bonds, among all the many excellent functions that they have, is also to help promote infant survival. That doesn't mean all pair bonds are about infant survival or do promote infant survival, but that might be one of their functions, especially in cases where one individual can't support themselves and an infant with calorically, with resources to survival and reproduction. And we might think of the nurturant system as being involved as invoking peptides like oxytocin, and we might think of the sexual system as involving testosterone. And so the idea is that there's basically two systems underlying pair bonds. So that's really the key part to look at. And so that's why we have partnered sexuality and partnered relationality. And that's going to become more clear as we go on, that we actually need to separate sexuality from relationships to theorize what's going on with all these diverse sexualities and in sexual minorities that have to do with sexuality and relationships. So what I want to do now is sort of start at the beginning, in the middle of the talk I realize, and talk about some of the research on testosterone and partnering that actually has led me to the sort of theoretical positions, frameworks that I've given you. And then I'm going to talk again about those frameworks so that you can kind of come back to them and see how what they sound like after you've heard the data. So because I'll be focusing on testosterone in my talk, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about it for those of you who aren't familiar. Testosterone is a steroid hormone that's released from our bodies, and you might know testosterone better from the Olympics when people are illegally taking it. But testosterone is a steroid hormone. It's present in women and men. People don't always know that it's present in women as well as men. And it's released from the ovaries, the testes, and the adrenal glands, which are better known for stress, as some of you might be thinking. And testosterone levels are much higher in men than they are in women, and women tend to be much more sensitive to testosterone than men are. Now, I want to say that testosterone is biological, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's biologically determined, because though genes contribute, there's a moderate to large genetic influence on what testosterone levels each of us have, there's also all sorts of other influences: diet, season, time of day, how you slept, whether you just had sex. I want to make a joke about that, but I'm holding back right now. And I also study social modulation of testosterone, so I'm interested in how social context affects testosterone in humans. And so we know that even social context can affect your testosterone levels. So testosterone is biological, but it's not necessarily fixed at birth, right? It's not one-to-one gene to testosterone. So there's a developmental trajectory to how your testosterone gets to be where it is at any one time. And so throughout my talk, I'm going to use the term gender sex when I'm talking about women and men, because I can't really be sure if whatever I'm talking about, when I just take a snapshot of adults, whether I'm talking about something that is resulting from the very different socialization experiences we give to girls and boys and women and men, or whether I'm talking about the very different hormonal and genetic contributions that women and men have. Now, in terms of the research, excuse me, partnered men, there's this body of research that I came to that is really fascinating to me that showed that partnered men had significantly lower testosterone than single men. And researchers, this was mostly people in biological anthropology and sociology, and what they had found is that people, these were all heterosexual men, whether they were married, whether they were in long-term relationships, they had lower testosterone than their single counterparts. Excuse me. People also looked at divorced men, and they found that divorced men had higher testosterone than the married men. So even though they were once married, they had higher testosterone. Now, there's some complexities in this research that hadn't been answered, like in most fields, right? So cause and effect was one of them. And there was some evidence for this transient increase in testosterone around divorce, but then it seemed to come back down. So was it divorce or the end of relationship? And you might think, aren't those the same? But divorce itself has a lot of social upheaval. There's a lot of things that go with divorce that might be affecting our bodies physiologically that isn't really necessarily only about getting out of, not being in a relationship anymore. Another reason to think about cause and effect, and people were kind of, and still kind of interpret this all as getting into relationships lowers your testosterone, getting out of them increases them, is that one of my colleagues in biological anthropology did this really interesting study looking at testosterone at the end of a day spent with the men's wife. This was the men themselves, not the experimenter. So they looked at the men at the end of the day spent with their wives versus the end of the day spent with their work colleagues, like at work, and they found no difference in testosterone, suggesting it wasn't, at least the day-to-day state things that were affecting men's testosterone. One of the really neat things, though, about doing research with biological anthropologists as colleagues is they do all the cross-cultural work that we really all, or I really should be doing, but I'm not because I'm trained in psychology. And so, for example, they went to Kenya and looked at Swahili men who have the option of being married monogamously or polygamously. They found that polygamously married men had significantly higher testosterone than monogamously married men. And that was really fascinating because you might think, okay, single men have high testosterone, monogamously married men have lower testosterone, so shouldn't men who have multiple marital partners have even lower testosterone? But they didn't find that, actually. They found that having multiple partners, marital partners, was associated with higher testosterone. And that was really key for helping me to theorize what might be at play. It's obviously not having a partner per se, but maybe something to me about the possibility of new partners, which being polygamously married includes. So that was one of the possibilities I thought about. They also looked at Chinese men in Beijing, And what was really fascinating again about this research is they found that it wasn't married men who had lower testosterone, it was married fathers. And that was also fascinating because what they've said about, what cultural anthropologists have said about this community is that being married doesn't actually necessarily limit your extra relationship sexual opportunities. And instead it's fatherhood that's when you stop straying or having fun outside, or however you want to conceptualize it. So that suggests that really it's not just relationships, which makes sense. It's really something about relationships, certain types of relationships, that is associated with different levels of T, right? We can't just say a relationship is a relationship is a relationship. Each culture has different expectations of what a relationship will be, and each person has different experiences of that relationship. So another final one is some other folks looked at Japanese men, and they found a very weak effect that partner men maybe have lower testosterone than single men. And they one of the possible interpretations of that research is that in this culture, the group that they studied, what they said is that being married is associated with some decreases in extra partner sexuality, but not as much as it would be here. And I don't mean to set Western communities as the standard, it's just that was where the bulk of the research had been done. Actually, in Boston around Harvard, which I think is so funny. So there's all these unanswered questions. Cause and effect is still completely unclear. And then the mechanism of what might be driving this is also unclear. And I think that's a question that's really suited for people in psychology. As well, there was very little identification of any social influences that might be affecting this. And then when we come to sexuality and gender, people had just been focusing on heterosexual men. So we really didn't know how much this translated. And knowing that could also help us think about mechanism, right? Is it being exposed to women all the time? Is it that you're a man exposed to women all the time or not? And so on. So now I want to talk about some of the research from my own lab on partnering and testosterone that led me to thinking about this question of relationship status versus relationship orientation and separating those out and thinking of them as parallels with gendered sexuality and sexual orientation. So the first study we did is we looked at people who were heterosexual or non-heterosexual, and we looked at men and women in both those groups. And I use non-hetero because they were people who varied along a scale from, if you think of the Kinsey scale that goes from, they were basically ranged from exclusively same-sex to, I think, I'm trying to remember, moderately, sort of bisexual to homosexual, but not necessarily by identity. So this was more by orientation. And what you see here is in the heterosexual men is we replicated the effect other people had found. So the yellow bar is the partnered individuals. They had significantly lower testosterone than the unpartnered individuals, and testosterone is along this axis. You can see here where there's another asterisk. That always indicates a significant difference. The partnered non-heterosexual women had significantly lower T than the unpartnered heterosexual women. And you can see the y-axis is different between the men and women because, as I said, their testosterone levels are markedly different. The heterosexual women show the pattern we would expect, but not a significant effect. And this actually led to sort of a red herring where we thought that sexual orientation mattered more for these relationship testosterone links than it did. Here, we didn't see the pattern in non-heterosexual men. And that one, for some reason, has actually held true throughout the rest of our studies, but we haven't really been able to look at it in depth. One, because I moved from Vancouver to Ann Arbor, and it's been harder to get larger groups of sexual minorities. And we need pretty large groups for this sort of research. And two, because I'm really interested in sexual diversity for understanding testosterone and partnering. So it's not really my main question to say, why do we see this in this group versus this group? Although it could be informative, but it hasn't led us to any informative directions right now. So we saw basically effects in women and men with some potential moderation by sexual orientation. We also had a really small longitudinal component to that study. So these are everyone at baseline, and these are everyone at follow-up. And you might notice that everyone's going up, and that's actually a seasonality effect. Like I mentioned before, there are seasonal effects on testosterone. So if you can just ignore that, I can answer questions. If you're into biological rhythms, as I know, I'm looking at, as I know some of you are, then we can talk about it. But it's not really that relevant for here. But what you can see here is this bottom aqua line are people who are unpartnered at baseline and became partnered by follow-up. So they got into a relationship. This middle line is people who were partnered at baseline and stayed partnered. And this blue group on top is people who were unpartnered at baseline and stayed unpartnered throughout. And what I think is really fascinating is these sort of bluish tinged groups, we could differentiate between them based on what they would go on to do, right? So at baseline, the ones who would go on to get into relationships had significantly lower testosterone than the ones who would stay unpartnered, suggesting that something about testosterone is predicting entering a relationship. Now, for those of you who are statsy, you'll notice there's no divergence or crossover of lines, right? And that's how you know from Stats 101 that there would be an interaction. And so what that means is that there's no evidence that entering a relationship changed testosterone levels. These are really small samples, though. So I think this is interesting and generative. I don't think it's definitive. But you also might notice we're missing one group, too, because we didn't have anyone who was partnered to unpartnered because they kept dropping out of our study and they didn't want to keep participating. Say, I got dumped and I don't want to participate anymore. And so we didn't have that group. We have some ongoing research right now where we have a larger longitudinal sample, and we're working on those data. We'll probably have them ready next semester. So this started me thinking about relationship status versus relationship orientation, because we had been thinking about relationship status and testosterone. But maybe it was relationship orientation that was linked to testosterone. So if we think of status as your current partnering situation, are you single, in a relationship, just to give two simple contrasts, versus relationship orientation, what's your approach to relationships? Are you interested in getting in long-term relationships? Is that what suits you? And so on. And this evidence gave some support to this relationship orientation construct because baseline testosterone predicted partnering. Then we did some research on partner presence because I was interested in further trying to get at the status orientation example or dichotomy. And for those of you who do animal or human research of this sort, you'll know that we actually cannot get ethics approval to randomly assign people to get into relationships or to break them up. And so we have to do creative methods to try to answer some of these questions because we can't do the experimental manipulations that our animal colleagues are so fortunate to be able to do. But that's one of the things I like about the human work is that it's sort of challenging and you have to be creative in not better ways, just different ways that suit me, and the animal work never did, I have to say. So what we did is we wanted to look at people with partners that they were with and long-distance partners. And this actually, you know, I haven't done much more, just as an aside, I haven't done much more work on long-distance relationships, but every year I have these students and I really want to because it's so increasingly prevalent. People are meeting, you know, people are in relationships with people they've never met physically. And it's really fascinating to think about what cues, what's going on in those different types of relationships. I think there's so much there to do. You know, also implications for, you know, business people, army people who are, don't always have choice about it. I think it's fascinating. But anyway, I also think this is fascinating, so I'll get back to this. So we looked at people who had same city partners and long distance partners because we were thinking, well, if you're either of those kinds of relationships, you're in a relationship, but only one of them has the daily physical partner cues, right? So you know, you can talk to your partner on the phone and so on. You can Skype. There's all, you know, you can send messages. Sometimes I think people are more in touch with their partners now than they ever were. But you don't have those physical partner cues, and that could be a really important key to physiological responses, right? It might be that that your body responds more to physical cues than it does to just talking cues or things like that. Not that those wouldn't be important either. But this was one way to try to tease those things apart. So what we found, and was really interesting, is that the same city-partnered women had significantly lower testosterone than the single women. And the long-distance partnered women were intermediate, in between. And we interpreted that as having those cues, those daily cues, was linked to the lower T in women. And being in a relationship still might be associated with lower T, but it wasn't significantly different and it was only intermediate. So there might be an effect of being in a relationship, or it might be an orientation, but there was this bigger effect of having a relationship partner that you engaged with every day. Now, in terms of the men, what we found is the same city-partnered men and the long-distance partnered men had lower T. This was significant. This was at a trend level compared to the single men. So regardless of whether your partner was there with you every day or was at a distance, you had lower testosterone. And we thought this seemed to support relationship status in women because the same-city partnering in women was linked with lower testosterone. In men, it seemed to suggest to us that testosterone was associated with relationship orientation. Partnering was linked with lower T in men, regardless of partner presence. So I also got interested in polyamory because I had a participant, for research purposes, because I had a participant write in a response on my relationship question saying, your options don't fit me. And that was the point where I stopped using box options like that and started having more write-ins. And it was really useful, especially because I was interested in sexual diversity of relationships, and I realized, wow, my questions are basically designed to ignore all the possible diversities out there I don't know about. It's not very scientific, right? So anyway, so we did a study where we did recruit polyamorous individuals, and what I want to highlight here is, so up on top are the women, below are the men, yellow is the single individuals, aqua are the monoamorously partnered individuals, they have one partner. Here are the polyamorously partnered individuals in the blue, and they have multiple partners, and they're polyamorous by identity. And here is this interesting group that I hadn't really thought about before, and that also helped me think about status versus identity. So these were what I called poly-lifestyle, where they had a polyamorous identity, but were just not currently multi-partnered. Right? So it's kind of like someone who considers themselves wanting to be in a relationship with someone, but just is currently single. Right? And then there's single people who want to be single. So there's all sorts of diversity. But not all polyamorous people have multiple relationships. Now what these data are showing is that the polyamorous participants had significantly higher testosterone, both the men and the women, compared to the monoamorously partnered participants. And so that was interesting because polyamory is this approach to relationships, and some of you, more people know about it now than when I was first talking about this research, but it's an approach to relationships that's about multiple, committed, sexual, loving relationships. And there's lots of definitions. I don't claim that to be the definitive one, but that's not a bad one. And we can debate that later if needed. And so it's fascinating because it kind of combines those two things, right? The love and the lust are coming together. What's also really interesting is I was curious whether it would be associated with higher testosterone than the singlehood, because I was thinking that polyamory would be sort of a pure group of people interested in having new or more sex partners, because and relationship partners, because singlehood could be people who don't want partners, right? They're happy being single. But it could also have people who are interested in new partners. Whereas polyamory includes people who are, part of their approach to relationships is about the possibility of new partners. And this poly-lifestyle group, what was so fascinating, and so what was interesting is that they were higher than singlehood, which is what we had sort of predicted was a possibility, suggesting that there is something about this potential for new partners that matters for higher T. Now, in terms of the poly-lifestyle group, that was so fascinating to us because you can see the differences relative to the polyamorous group. So if you sort of focus on this half of the graph, you can see in the men that regardless of their current status, whether they had multiple partners or whether they were interested in multiple partners, they had higher T. Over here, though, it was only the women who had multiple partners that were interested, that had higher T. And the women who had a poly lifestyle did not have higher T. So you needed something about needing to have the multiple partners that was associated with higher T in women. So again, I think these results are kind of consistently pointing to similar patterns where multi-partnering is linked with higher testosterone in women, but not interest in polyamory. That's not linked with higher T. And T is linked to relationship orientation in men because it was the polyamorous approach that was linked with higher T in men, regardless of the multi-partnering status. Now, one final piece of research I want to talk to you about is we looked at people in casual relationships, and you can think of that's kind of the opposite of polyamory in some ways, or the opposite of many things, depending on how you conceptualize it, because casual relationships don't have that commitment that polyamory does. So what we have here is, here's the women, and what this is showing is that women who were in the casual relationships or the long-term relationships had lower testosterone than the single women. So whereas in the men, only the men in the long-term relationships. So what that suggested to us is that casual relationships in men are, in terms of testosterone, more like singlehood, and then in women are more like long-term relationships. But we also were really curious about what factors might help explain that pattern, right? Because casual relationships themselves can differ in all sorts of places. So first off, we found that the women and men, when we asked all sorts of parameters about the casual relationships, it was actually really similar. So it wasn't just that the women were having different kinds of casual relationships, and that's why their testosterone relative to the single women showed one pattern and the men a different pattern. Instead, what we found is that when we did some statistics, we found that the frequency of partnered sexual activity accounted for this pattern of results. So their actual sexual behavior right now. Well, not right now, but currently. And in men, what accounted for it was their overall dating desires. So how interested they were in finding and dating new partners. So again, this had fit with some of our predictions and supported, again, this notion that testosterone is linked to relationship status in women and relationship orientation in men. So I just want to summarize really briefly some of these data that I presented to you. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that we seem to be finding that testosterone is related to partnering in women and men. So people had often only looked at men or will assume that we have to find either the same pattern in women and men or very different patterns in women and men. And what we found is a mix of both, that we don't want to emphasize gender and we don't want to under-emphasize it. We found that testosterone and partnering are linked in women and men, but we found that the way it seems to be linked is different. So we found that same-city partnering was linked with lower testosterone in women, multi-partnering, but not an approach to multi-partnering, was linked with higher T in women, and partnered status was linked to lower T in women. And in men, relationship orientation was linked to testosterone. Baseline T predicted partnering. Partner presence didn't affect the association. Polyamorous approach was linked with higher T. And interest in new partners was linked with higher T. So coming back to this idea of thinking about relational orientation and sexual orientation together, I had thought, okay, if we have this Kinsey scale where we have strictly homosexual or same sex over here, strictly other sex over here, and in the middle we have bisexual, interested in both sexes, both genders, pansexual, interested in all genders, and then person, not gender, that it's really the person and not their gender that characterizes your sexual orientation. And then we might put sort of non-sexual over here. We don't really know what to do with that always. We could maybe think of the same thing and, for relational orientation. And I realized I had been thinking of polyamory as being along here, right? Polyamorous individuals will tell us that it's about multiple relationships that are nurturant and sexual. So it's not necessarily over here, but I realized some of the way I was thinking about it in terms of testosterone was like this. And that's relevant for some of the things I want to talk about now. So we went back, we had thought, okay, relationship orientation seems to exist, but what is it exactly, right? We're trying to figure this out in a little more detail. And so we went back to the lab and wanted to do more research with polyamorous individuals, again, because they have this really fascinating mix of being high on nurturance and high on sexuality, right? Both, multiple committed, loving, romantic sexual relationships. And I wanted to understand how monoamory and polyamory and hormones were linked, but also attending to gender, sex, and sexuality. So I want to tell you briefly about the sample. These are some data that we've just been analyzing over the summer and are starting to write up. So they're fresh. Only one specialized sex research community has ever heard about this. I bring these to you. Okay. So in terms of gender and sexual identities, along here are sexual identities in terms of gender and sexuality. This column is the monoamorous participants. Here's the polyamorous participants. And you can see it's actually quite a big sample for this sort of study. We don't have hormones for all of them, by far. And just a few interesting things I want to point out about the participants is the majority of the monoamorous participants were heterosexual, whereas about only half of the polyamorous participants were heterosexual. And in fact, quite a large proportion of our polyamorous participants identified as bi or pansexual. And so I don't have any larger comment to make about that, except that I think it's really interesting to think about sexual minorities are obviously linked in a fourth way, which is that they can overlap for various reasons. That's not to say at all that one sexual minority identity, orientation, or status necessarily or always or frequently does overlap with another, but that there's sometimes reasons to think about them together. So in the poly women, we found the expected pattern that we had hoped to find before. And these were just some really preliminary analyses I was doing to start getting into richer analyses. And what this is showing is that the polyamorous women had significantly higher testosterone than the monoamorous women. Okay, so that's what we would expect. Excuse me. And then I got to the men. And so far, what's interesting is my data with women had followed, for any of you who follow sex research closely, there's this sort of script that like, men are so simple and women are so complicated, right? People will show that diagram. I'm probably ruining like 800 people's talks coming up, but people will show that diagram with like, women have all these different switches for sexual arousal, for example, and then men have like one switch, and it's ha. And I was like, oh, it's kind of too bad that my data fit that like the women are always a little bit more nuanced. There's some complications like with the sexual orientation and so on, but you know, that's what my data are. And then so there was like a little part of me that was like, haha, the men are more complicated here. But then also most of me was like, you know, your stomach drops out. For those of you who do research, you know that feeling of like, this isn't just no result, this is the wrong results. So now what? And I was saying at lunch with some grad students that that's actually a point where, you know, the goal of science, ostensibly, right, is try to falsify our hypotheses. That's what we're supposed to be doing, not prove them, but try to falsify them. And so when you come up with something that does that, I think it was really helpful for me to take it as a moment of like, okay, well, let's go back to basics. Let's try to re-engage with some of my initial assumptions. So this is a bit of a busy slide, so if you follow what I'm saying, that's sort of what I did. I went back to basics about polyamory. So it's many loves, also new partners, also multiple partners, right? And polyamory, polyamor is many loves itself. Now, a polyamorous, I realized, so I'm getting people who identify as polyamorous, right? And I'm kind of, at this point, I make it sound like I have identity, status, orientation all figured out. But this is something I've sort of come to after doing this research, that really their overlap and their differences matter so much, even when you're not a public health researcher, even when you're not a humanist, right? They matter even for someone who's doing basic behavioral neuroendocrinology and basic sex research. So I'm getting people who have a polyamorous identity, and they could fit in, if we think of, remember those two categories, partnered sexuality, partnered relationality, so the lust and the love kind of groupings. We could think of polyamorous individuals falling in, their identity could be here, and their identity could be here. Right? I don't know where that identity is. I didn't ask. I asked other questions to get at it. But really what I realized I was trying to ask is which orientation, right? Are they high on partnered sexuality, high on partnered relationality, or both? And that's really critical because what I've been proposing all along is that it's interest in new partners for men that is the T key, that is associated with the higher testosterone. So it's not identity. It's not polyamory. Although you might expect polyamorous individuals to be higher on interest in partnered sexuality than other people on average. But it's really this interest in new partners. So if we want to think about that, you know, before I had that one scale, now I'm going to have two. So here we have that gendered sexuality or sexual orientation. And originally I saw polyamorous people as being high on the two axes, and I'm just going to explain them really briefly. We could think of people as being multi-relational. They're interested in multiple romantic, nurturant relationships. Unirelational, they're interested in one. Or what I horrendously call any-relational, which is, it doesn't really map onto bisexual because you can't really be interested in both one and many, right? That's like logically impossible. So instead, it's more like person, not gender. It's relationship, not number, right? It doesn't really, you know, if the right relationship comes along, great, but you're fine with one. You know, or you're fine with many if there's many, and then if they turn to one, you're fine with that. And then non-relational would be over here, people who aren't interested in any relationships. And then we can also think of partnered sexuality, again, people who are unisexual, interested in having one sex partner, multisexual, people who are interested in having multiple, and anisexual, again, it's the sex partner, not the number that matters, sort of like the person, not gender midpoint. And then here would be non-sexual. You're not interested in sex partners at all. And I had conceptualized polyamorous people as being pretty high on both. But I realized polyamory could actually be anywhere along here for partnered relationality and anywhere along here for partnered sexuality. But for testosterone, this is what I was predicting, right? That the high T was associated with multisexuality. So it's like this part was kind of irrelevant for the testosterone, and this part was kind of irrelevant for the testosterone, and this is what I was theorizing. And depending on the polyamorous people in my sample, they could be anywhere along here, right? And probably on average, they'd be higher on partnered sexuality than the average monoamorous person, right? That just makes sense because it's that approach. But there's no guarantee they're all going to be up here. right? So then I went back to the data and then back to the theory again. And I sort of had this new prediction, which was kind of exciting to be able to go back to my data with a prediction to try to test. And the theory-derived prediction was, are high T poly individuals more sexual and or less relational? So I was able to actually go back and try to understand that by testing a new hypothesis. So what I found here is, first of all, what I want to explain is, here's partner number. So 0, these are polyamorously identified individuals who have no partners, right? Which is possible, right? You could be polyamorous but just not have any partners. Have only one partner. Again, you could be polyamorous but only have one partner currently. And then so on and so on. And I can tell you from the research that this is kind of outlier, maybe 4 to, not in this group obviously, but 5 and 6 is less usual, depending on the people you're asking, but on average. The women, you can see, it doesn't really matter about their partner number. It seems to be, so, you know, they're having sex partners, and they have similar testosterone levels regardless of how many sex partners, because they're having sex partners, is the way I interpret it. The men, though, you can see that people on both ends are the ones with the higher T. Now again, these ends are really small, so this is kind of a generative, this is theory-derived hypothesis testing, but also meant to be generative for future studies. And what I was thinking is that maybe people on the bottom end who have a polyamorous approach are looking for new partners, and maybe people up on the higher end are on the higher end because they're quite multisexual, and that's why they're having multiple partners. And so that these two groups are multisexual. Now that's just speculative, right? That's just story making. But what I did is I looked at some of the questions we had that were relevant to this, and I found that the multisexual partners were more sexual and less nurturant, which did support the theory. So they had more sexual encounters. This group also had more dating partners. They're also less nurturant, which you can interpret in some ways as being more sexual. They had less cuddling, fewer lifetime romantic partners. They were less happy with their relationships, lower commitment and investment. And for the high group, more ends of relationships and less sleeping in the same bed, which I do some work on cuddling, and so I'm really interested in sleeping in the same bed as an indicator of intimacy. So you can see that these groups actually did have some markers that would suggest their approach was, their orientation was more multisexual. So basically what I realized is it's not polyamorous identity that I was interested in, but that polyamory ended up being an imperfect proxy for multisexuality. And this study helped me realize that. Because again, it was sort of people who are over here that I was interested in. Now, people often talk about, let's say, people who cheat or players, like how is that the same or different as polyamory? And so I want to talk about the utility of thinking about these two as separate scales for thinking through how these things do compare and don't compare. So if we think about cheating, we might think of someone who's cheating as being unirelational. They might identify as monogamous or want to be monogamously partnered. Or they might be non-relational. They might not want a relationship at all. But you know, in our culture, you're supposed to have a relationship. And then we might think of them as being up here in the any sexual to multisexual category, that they either have an orientation that is oriented towards having multiple sex partners, or when the right sex partner comes along, that's important to them. And we might think of a player, well, I don't know, how did I get to talking about players? Sometimes I think of the thing, like I study cuddling, you don't know, but I study masturbation, I study players. A player we would think of as someone who's non-relational, but who's multisexual. Right? And so you can see how these different things that actually seem really similar can be differentiated. And I don't think they necessarily have to be differentiated, right? People have argued that sometimes people want to draw boundaries like, well, polyamory is good because it's multiple committed relationships, and player is bad because it's only multiple sex partners. And that's not how I mean it at all. I mean, I don't have any judgment on these, and I don't think the utility is saying, like, now we can categorize what's good and bad. For me, the goal is we can actually disentangle these things that we somehow understand to be different but can't quite find the language to explain it. And then so we might expect some cheaters and some multisexual people to have higher T, and some players to have higher T if they fall into this area. Related to that, I want to talk about just briefly asexuality. And people tend to put asexuality here for identity, and I think there's lots of strategic reasons to do that, and I don't want to minimize those. But I do think for the purposes of the sort of things I'm talking about, I think they fit actually over here in partnered sexuality, and I'm going to tell you why. One thing is that asexuality isn't about gender. It's not about the person's gender. It's not about the gender of the person that they're interested in. It's not a gendered, has nothing to do with gender in it. I'm not saying there's nothing gendered or feminist about it, or there couldn't be any critiques, but it's not really a gendered phenomenon in terms of its expression. It's also not about arousability. So people have brought asexual individuals into the lab, and they found that we can actually arouse them. Or, you know what, our asexual individuals report masturbating. So are they really asexual? Like, that doesn't even make sense. But what I want to argue is that it's not that they're not sexual, it's that they're not interested in sex partners, which is what partnered sexuality is about, right? The other thing is people will say, well, there's this asexual person, but he or she has a girlfriend or a boyfriend or is married. And how does that work? And again, the thing I want to say is that asexuality is not about relationality, so it doesn't fit in there as well. And just to show you how I mean that on the scale, we would put an asexual person, a person who's asexual by identity, as having a non-sexual identity. And then they could fall anywhere along this line of relationality the same way a non-asexual person could. So now I want to close and wrap up with some conclusions and implications. I think that some of the main implications of this research is that it does really seem to point to this construct of relationship orientation, but that it's not one, that there's partnered relationality and partnered sexuality. I think the data convincingly point to multisexual orientation being linked to higher T in men, or at least converging on that point, and that multisexual status, or just sexual status, is linked to higher T in women. I also think what's interesting is we often think of hormonal research as separate from social research. And I think that this research highlights why we need social complexity, even in basic behavioral neuroendocrine research, and why it's valuable to incorporate both sexual minorities and majorities into the same research, because we can gain all sorts of insights that we wouldn't otherwise. I think this research is also sort of the opposite of biological reductionism. If anything, this testosterone research just like exploded all these relationship categories, right? You're all like, whoa, my head. I think it fits into some of the tenets that we like to think of with feminist science studies, which are attention to diversity, attention to context, not trying to reduce and oversimplify things, but paying attention to the complexity that is inherent to the phenomena we're studying. And I also think there's these fascinating gender-sex similarities and differences, so it's a bit of a model for paying attention to gender-sex without giving it too much power, by ignoring it, or by over-attending to it. And in terms of sexual minority identities, I think that this research helps us. I think stigma can be an important rallying cry, for sexual minority groups to rally around, and I don't want to minimize that. But at the same time, I think sexualities are also tied together conceptually in these sexual configurations and these sexual facets, in terms of identities, orientations, and statuses, and that we can think of sexual configurations that each person has that has multiple aspects to it, not just gender, right? There's at different times and places in history, people have focused on different things like age, gender, race, various things that really matter and change over time. And I also want to sort of close by saying that studying diverse sexualities is really helpful for understanding basic sexuality knowledge, and that what people call thinking from the margins has been really helpful for my own research in terms of trying to understand these broader sexual patterns that I couldn't quite make sense of before. So I just want to acknowledge that the last polyamory study I talked about was funded by the American Institute of Bisexuality, various people for helpful discussions. And a lot of the studies I described in 1 minute are actually quite complex and take a lot of time, and there's a lot of logistics. So my lab has been really critical in helping get that done. And I also want to thank Mark Breedlove for having me and hosting this wonderfully interesting series of talks, and also all of you for your attention, and welcome any of your questions.
Again, I know some people may need to go, but we have plenty of time in the room, so if there are questions you have, I'm going to ask, if you have questions, I want to bring the microphone to you so that we get them recorded. So.
Yeah, I have a question relating to the graph showing differing levels of testosterone in men depending on how many partners they do have. Yeah, that one. So you focused on either end of the scale. And what I found most interesting looking at this was the middle, why there's a dip like that.
Right.
And do you know if that has anything to do with there just being like a critical threshold beyond which, if say having more than a certain number of partners involves, say, a transition between okay, I'm having a couple different people I'm having relationships with, and there's the commitment part, which, I mean, the lowering down of testosterone because you've got somebody you're committed to and you're having a relationship with, but then once you have enough, it's not the relationship because there's so many partners.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities that we need to get into. And these were the questions I asked, not knowing that this was going to come out. So these were the questions I was able to tap into to try to explain the pattern, but I can't get at all the possible reasons. And so your question is a good one. So one of the things I'm sort of thinking that I didn't quite get into the complexity of this, but some of you might kind of be thinking it, is that, so here I'm sort of trying to talk about relationship orientation being associated with testosterone in men, but I also do all sorts of research on social modulation of testosterone in men and women. And so I would think that actively looking for new partners itself could actually be associated with higher testosterone. And so this is the speculation part that I need to go back and test. But one of the things I'm thinking is that this is about the looking, and this is about having, having a really high multisexual orientation. And that might be one of the reasons you're able to deal with having that many partners. Because what's interesting about the polyamorous community, even though people will talk about, oh, it must be a men's paradise, which it's actually, there's lots of women involved. If anything, they might be more than there are men. People who know about stereotypical masculinity would not think that polyamory should stereotypically be the haven of men, because it's about multiple relationships, is about communication, lots of communication. So I was on a polyamory panel at a sex research conference, and one of my co-presenters, his talk was communicate, communicate, communicate. So it's all about talking through relationship dynamics. But so that's a lot. And for those of you who have one partner, you might know that it's a lot to manage. And so one of the things a lot of monoamorous people will say is how does anyone have time to be polyamorous? It's not for the sex necessarily, because that could be really quick, but it's more for the how do you have time to actually talk about all these things? And so it's possible that for whatever reason, these people are having more sexual encounters. Perhaps they're getting more out of that part of it, and that's why. But there's all sorts of possible reasons that we need to look into. I think the data do support this interpretation, but the n's are small, and the study wasn't designed to answer this specific question because I didn't yet know I had it.
I kind of got the sense, Sari, at the end that you sort of answered this, but I'm wondering, why do you think testosterone is so important?
Yeah, why I think it's why I study, or why I think it's important in this framework.
Why focus so much on it?
Well, so what I think is really fascinating about testosterone is it can help us differentiate between these two evolved systems. Let me go back. Wow, there's a lot of slides. Who made this talk? Okay, so if you look here, so oxytocin is fascinating. There are people in the room who study oxytocin. I love it, you love it, let's all love it. It's love, right? Let's love it. It's wonderful. But one of the interesting things is that we actually can't really differentiate between these two systems using neuropeptides. So one of the fascinating insights of recent research has been that similar systems underlie love in romantic relationships and in parent-infant relationships, which is really kind of super cool. I think that's really neat. And I think that we all do. That's one of the reasons it's really captured our attention. But one of the really neat things testosterone does that oxytocin or other peptides can't really do is it helps us differentiate between these systems, because the sexual system should, let's say, increase testosterone or be associated with higher testosterone, while the nurturance system should decrease testosterone, if anything. I have some other graphs that I haven't really, I'm trying to decide whether to show you. Maybe not. But so the nurturance system basically contributes to both. And so, well, let me see. I'm going to bring it up and see if it's helpful or not. It's at the end of the talk, the secret slide. Here we go. So we can actually separate out testosterone related to, so we can separate out sexual systems from partnering or nurturance systems, because we have different predictions about how they'll be related to testosterone. Whereas some of you might know that we expect, we would expect cuddling with your infant to increase oxytocin, cuddling with your partner to increase oxytocin, orgasm to increase oxytocin, massage to increase oxytocin, right? We have very similar expectations about those things, but for testosterone, we have very different expectations and predictions. And so we can actually test for these different underlying neurobiological systems. So what's fascinating about oxytocin is we could test for the same, that different stimuli we expect to be different, have the same response. Fascinating. With testosterone, we can show that what we think of as similar stimuli have different responses. So we would expect cuddling with your infant versus cuddling with your partner to have different responses in terms of testosterone. And so to me, testosterone has been really useful in thinking about those differently and in helping me differentiate these different sexual minority identities and orientations and statuses. So it's helped me tease apart what we're thinking about when we think about sexual and relational diversity.
This question is a little out there, but I have spoken to a number of transgendered female to male individuals who have talked about a change in sexual orientation after taking testosterone for some time. Is there any information about that at all? Or, so this is like, yeah, so these are female to male transgendered individuals who had identified as lesbians prior to that and were sort of at first in the transition attracted to females, and then that started to shift. And we think of sexual orientation, well, I mean, I know for women we think of it as more fluid than for men, but we think of it as reasonably stable over a short period of time. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
So I don't have too many. I mean, there's research. So from what I know is that there is not research on the effects of testosterone treatment, either blockers or administration, on gender of target person, on the gender of the people you're sexually interested in. There is some evidence about sexual desire, and there are some narratives, so about desire especially. But from what I know, I don't know of that research, unfortunately. There might be someone else, or maybe one of the speakers coming in throughout the series will be able to answer that as well.
Yeah, I think Ray Blanchard, for example, is probably going to be able to address that. Other questions? I have one, of course, and because the last thing you want is more complexity in your life. But the other thing I think about in terms of the polyamory community is, I mean, and you may have some hints about this from your talking with these folks, is the changes that were going to happen across the lifespan in terms of, is this part of a developmental trajectory, and are there going to be changes in their relational status and or their sexual status as they grow older?
That's a fascinating question, and it's funny because with testosterone we often control for age in our analyses because there's these big age differences. But that doesn't mean we couldn't restrict age and then look within different age cohorts and see if there are patterns. And so far, I don't know. I haven't seen anything in my data, but I haven't been looking. And in fact, I've been unlooking. And I'm thinking of the qualitative stuff I know, and I don't actually know that people have started thinking about it that way. It seems like people are sort of trying to describe it. People are now trying to make sure they're not focusing on white-only communities because that's where a lot of research has been looking, and also very Western, also very North American focused. So I don't know, but that's really fascinating to think about. And it's fascinating to think about among all sorts of relational statuses what happens, because we often think about asexuality as someone, I think right now people might imagine sort of a younger person, like in their 20s. But we can also imagine people in relationships who are married or in long-term relationships who are no longer sexually active, but we don't question their relationship status, right? And so there's all sorts of ways to think about developmental trajectories in this that I don't think we've even really started to look at.
A point of clarification. When you recruit polyamorous individuals, what are you asking them about themselves? How would they qualify?
Okay, so depending on the study, sometimes we'll just recruit for people who have multiple partners or for people who identify as polyamorous, and then we ask about their identity and their status in our questionnaires. In the more recent one, we tried to recruit specifically people who identified as polyamorous. Beg your pardon? Yes, who use the word. And of course, not everyone does. There are people who don't even know that the word exists and that the community exists. And there are people who are practicing similar relationship approaches but don't feel like they fit into polyamory because maybe they don't want to self-label, or maybe they see it as a really white movement the same way a lot of people of color don't really feel like they always fit into the gay and lesbian movement.
You've talked about polyamory as a group that you identify more as people who are seeking additional relationships or are open to additional relationships, and have you considered the idea that, or the people who could identify as polyamorous and are involved in multiple relationships, but are at that point satisfied with the relationships that they're in, or not seeking further relationships, and how that impacts their...
That's a great point, and that's one thing I sort of meant to say here that I didn't at all, which is that perhaps this group is the people, we didn't ask, are you satisfied with the number of partners you had, because I didn't know to ask that in this. But that's one of the things I'm thinking, that these people are maybe those people, because they are polyamorous by identity and by status, right? And these are the people who are sort of set in, not looking for others. So one of the interesting things about polyamory is you might say the parallel between monogamy could be polyfidelity. So monogamy being, committed to your partner is not only a function of monoamory, right? You can be committed to your multiple partners as well. So that polyfidelity is a word that the poly community uses to describe that. Now, what's interesting to me is I don't quite know if polyfidelity means committed to your multiple relationship partners or committed to your multiple relationship partners and no others. And it seems to me that part of polyamory is having multiple partners, but also being open to the possibility of new loves. But it would be really, I think your suggestion is a great one, to try to separate out individuals who are like, I'm polyamorous because I have multiple partners, and I'm interested in having multiple partners, versus I'm polyamorous because I'm always open to the possibility of new partners. And I think that's a really fascinating distinction that would get at a lot of the things I'm curious about.
So they might be polyamorous in their outlook and yet only happen to be one partner, have one partner, rather. Right? Well, so Doug, you might have some more questions that come on up and ask. Thanks.